All right, good morning, everyone. So we were doing rehearsal yesterday, and I told one of our marketing people that I was going to come up here and do a little bit of stand-up, and they're like, oh, that's really funny, but don't do that. I'm going to do it anyway, so I'm going to give it a try. So here's a little joke for you to kind of break the morning open. Salesperson leaves this earth and finds themselves in front of a panel of analysts, and the analysts say, you're going to have two choices. You're going to go up or you're going to go down. And what would you like? And the salesperson says, well, I think I know what up looks like. Let's go see down. So analyst takes them to what down is, and it's a beautiful tropical paradise and music and people laughing and having fun. And the salesperson says, wow, this is amazing. I didn't think this was going to be so awesome. I think I'll take down. And in an instant, finds themselves in a desolate desert, hot fire, all the worst things that you can think of. And the salesperson says, whoa, 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 time out. What happened to the tropical paradise? And the analyst says, that was just the demo. So we think about AI and we think about generative AI and all these things, and the parallel is sometimes the hype doesn't meet the reality. We're going to talk today about the responsible nature that we need to take, this approach with artificial intelligence, especially all this new technology that we're developing so quickly. So with no further ado, I'm going to welcome my guest to the stage, Venkat Ramamurthy, who is our Chief Product Officer, Ben Eubanks, who's a very well-known analyst in the space, and Commissioner Keith Sonderling of the EEOC. Please welcome them.
Thanks.
All right, here we are. All these people are here to hear from all three of you. The first question I have is a very simple one. Just introduce yourself briefly and what you're known for, and I'll start with you, Commissioner.
I'm Keith Sonderling. I'm Commissioner of the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Don't run. The lights are very bright. I can't see your name tags and what company you work for.
Yeah.
So as you know, most of you know the EEOC from charge of discrimination, saying, oh, we're in trouble, and that's what we're going to try to prevent today. So thank you so much for having me.
Goodness gracious, following that. This is going to be awesome. I'm Ben Eubanks. I'm the Chief Research Officer for Lighthouse Research and Advisory. I've written a couple of books, but the one probably most relevant to this conversation is a book called Artificial Intelligence for HR, which looks at AI technologies and how they play a role in how we support and hire our people. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Venkat, and I lead product at Phenom. Just about 20 years of experience in analytics and AI space. I'm a vegetarian, and at the same time, I can speak 7 languages.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Now follow that. I don't know how to do that. So, the first real question is, and I'll pose it to you, Commissioner, which is, AI has been in HR for quite a while. Why the increased focus? What is causing that?
Well, you know, it's really important that we're focusing on it now because it's no longer a question of, am I going to use AI in HR or am I going to use HR technology? And you know, the last few years, I think the mass implementation of this was still questionable. There was so much debate, especially in Washington, about, oh, what does this even mean? What is HR technology? That's robots. That's only going to apply to certain industries like manufacturing or retail. But now we're at the point where to be competitive with today's marketplace, you have to use HR technology. You have to use AI in the workplace. So the question we're trying to figure out, and why I'm grateful to be here and I want to have this discussion, is, so now you know you have to use it. So how are you going to use it, and what purpose are you going to use it for, and how are you still going to comply with the long-standing civil rights laws? Because unlike other uses of AI that you may be using in your businesses to make deliveries faster, to make widgets better, cheaper, when you're dealing with AI in our space, you're dealing with some of the most fundamental civil rights we have in this country. And that's the ability to enter and thrive in the workforce and make a living for your family without being discriminated against. And those same principles still apply to this HR technology, and that's what I'm really trying to raise awareness of.
It's good to know. I think I'd like to hear from Ben just in terms of what do you hear from the business community when we talk about this focus? What's the concern?
Yeah, absolutely. So the research we do every year covers thousands of employers, thousands of candidates, and workforce responses as well. So we're talking and hearing from the people that you employ. And these perspectives, one of the things that I draw from all of those conversations is employers have, in some cases, adopted technology they didn't know had it, right? Phenom's really good about being open, saying, hey, we're using these tools, but there are other ones that you may have in your technology stack right now that you have no clue what those decisions are actually being made. We were having a conversation earlier and saying, hey, some general counsel legal will say, hey, we're never going to use those things. That's crazy. Like, oh, by the way, that's already in place. You're already using that technology. It's how you're hiring people right now. And because of that, I'm encouraging every leader I talk to, like you don't have to be a technology expert, you don't have to know how it's built, all those kinds of things, but you are the bias expert in the business, and you have to know how to have that conversation in a deep enough way to make you feel comfortable and make the rest of your leadership feel comfortable that you are doing the right thing for your people.
Yeah, later, as we talk about things, what we're going to do is get to how do you have that conversation? What are the questions? So we're going to come back to that. But just a quick show of hands. How many folks here have concerns about the new laws and regulations and sort of the issues that are coming up legally? Think about that New York Law 144 and some of these other laws around the world. How many are concerned about AI in the workplace? Just a quick show of hands. Yeah. I think everyone's pretty much raising their hand, right? So this shows you how serious this subject is. And on that, I'll throw it back to Commissioner Sonderling. How do we work with an organization like the EEOC? You're working with the buyers, the builders of these technologies, and the government agencies responsible for maintaining civil rights.
And here's the tricky part for us, is that we know what we know very well, the longstanding civil rights laws that have been around since the 1960s. What we don't know, and the government is going to still have a very difficult time with this across the board, is how these algorithm works, and what's going into it, and all that complicated stuff. There's so much distraction in Washington, D.C., and different states and cities and countries that are trying to dive into this and saying, well, if we only saw the algorithm, we'd be able to show there's bias. And you see that with social media companies and tech companies. If we could see that, well, you could show it to me as a prior labor and employment lawyer, or you could show it to any of our federal investigators that show up to your businesses, and you could show them the algorithm, and what would we know what to do with it? It's a bunch of numbers. But what we do know is the results. And I've been trying to really simplify this in the equation of whether we need a new AI commission, do we need new laws, do we need a new focus on that? Forget about all that. We all, whether you're an HR professional, you understand about bias in the workplace, about bias in hiring and bias in selection and promotions, et cetera. And how do you do that? You look at the results. And that's all our federal investigators are going to do. When we see bias, how did we get there? And under US law, it doesn't matter if an AI did that bias or a human did that bias. Liability is going to be the same either way. So we just need to take a step back and say, we all know to find bias. If we see bias in results, how did we get there? And in a sense, AI can make that process much more transparent. Because what have we been left with? When somebody doesn't get a job, somebody doesn't get a promotion, they were claimed they were discriminated against. What do we have to do? We interview the hiring manager. We have to, depose their boss who didn't give them that promotion. And you talk about the black box of AI, and so many people want to drive fear about that. But what about the black box of somebody's brain, right? All we can do is depose them, and we know nobody ever lies, right? And we also know that, oh yeah, I didn't hire that person because she's a woman. I didn't hire this person because of this country or religion. It just doesn't happen. So there is a positive use in AI in the sense where it makes the process very transparent. And now as employers, and it helps us across the board, with the transparency, it helps the employees see the factors that went into the decision. It helps employers to make that very clear, to see it's actually taking this skills-based approach, not just the preferences of one individual, which may have bias. And from our perspective, too, it shows that in good faith, they're really trying to have neutral metrics in there relevant to the job, opposed to, well, you're my buddy, tap on the shoulder recruiting policy, apply for this job, wink, wink. That doesn't happen when it comes to these transparent AI systems.
So sticking with you just for a minute, because I think one of the things that I'd like to understand, what is the technical knowledge debt inside the government? You talk about it's just a bunch of numbers, but is that true for government in general? Is there a challenge in understanding innovation and technology?
Well, I can't speak for other agencies, of course. I have to give you a Washington, D.C. answer. But from our perspective, with our limited resources we have around 2,200 employees across the nation at the EEOC. And every case of discrimination, whether you're a private employer, state and local government, or the federal government, we see every single case. So in our limited resources, we're not going to become tech experts because we have to be civil rights experts, and that's what our investigators and our lawyers have to do. So, in that sense, I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of studies about how the government can't compete with Google and Amazon and Facebook and just the hiring of these engineers. So it's my job to really work with the regulated community, work with vendors, work with everyone in this ecosystem, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to make sure that everyone's at the table so everyone can understand and explain what they know, so it gets part of the broader equation of how we get this right and how we do this to actually remove bias from this employment decision making, which has been around since way before the civil rights laws were enacted.
So we talk about trying to remove bias, and I think of the common phrase that we talk about, which is human in the loop. So maybe Venkat, when you think about it from a product perspective, how are we thinking about the human in the loop?
Yeah, first, I think it's a great question. Thank you. I would really go back to the basics of why human in the loop, and the aspect of really making an AI being an arbiter is a bad dream, a coexistential crisis for all of us. And at Phenom, we have a policy to make sure that every decision that's being done across acquisition or talent management or an evolution of employee is done by a human. AI essentially serves as a co-pilot or a cobot, nudging and giving out recommendations to the human in the loop. How do we do it? How do we operationalize it? It's pretty simple. Every single time in the AI frame of world, when there is an anomaly, our systems, our data engine detects those anomalies, brings it back into our data engine, essentially starts thinking about a shadow model training, and presents it back to a team of 50 ML scientists that we have who actually look at those anomalies and really start thinking about, is it a good thing or a bad thing of a talent signal back to the community. So in every aspect of how we operationalize, one from decision intelligence at the point of making a decision to how we build models, is all human-led.
So Ben, you've talked about human in the loop extensively. So same question to you.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I thought of is there's a great book written a couple years ago, not mine, that was called Prediction Machines. And it looks at AI as it was being developed. And this, this really shouldn't be a decision engine, as you were saying, right? This is a prediction engine. We should use it as such. And where that prediction is delivered is where the human needs to step in and make the final whatever decision it is, right? If the AI recommends something, are you going to fire it? No, right? But we need to have a person in the mix here. And that's why I said earlier, like, you are the bias experts in the business. You are the ones who know where that line is, what you can cross, what you can't. And I like that you talked about results and what you're focusing, they should focus on is the outcomes, because you've always been held accountable for that. And all of this noise doesn't change those sorts of fundamental things. So human in the loop means that there's going to be a job opportunity for all of you for the foreseeable future.
Right. And so I'm just so we get the full spectrum, Commissioner, your response just in terms of how you view human in the loop from your responsibilities.
I'm going to sound like a lawyer, but it doesn't matter. The results are going to be what we're looking at. Right. So whether it's a robot making it, or whether it's a human making it, or a combination of both, from the difficult part from you as employers is that, that end result is going to be your liability. Either whether it's a good decision or a bad decision or mediocre decision, a legal decision or a non-legal decision, it's still, at the end of the day, those results are ultimately going to be on you, and that cannot get lost in the equation. And I think it does with some of the confusion around AI and automation of who ultimately is responsible for that final decision. So obviously, there's a lot of benefits of having a human in the loop there, especially when it comes down further in the line about software that's dealing with the accommodation process, software that's managing individuals in their workforce, software that's giving some of the scheduling or some of the what your production quotas are for the day. No matter how sophisticated a robot or an AI may be, they may not know that that person can't hit the goals for that day because they need an accommodation. And if you had a human there, which when managers used to walk the floor before it was done through AI and chatbots, you'd see that person is struggling. And as in HR, you'd know that you'd okay to ask that person, are you struggling because you needed accommodation because of a disability, because a religious accommodation, or due to a pregnancy? And that human in the loop element can never be lost from HR, because that takes to human interaction. So, I know not to focus today about down the road uses of AI, but it is a big, very important part where there are some uses where the law requires that a human has to be involved in those decision makings just because there's no computer sophisticated enough to know that as HR, that empathy side as well, which also has legal ramifications.
So if we keep going down that thread, we talk about adverse impact. Like, how do we measure? You talk about objectives. The end result is what we're measuring, what we're examining, and we're looking for bias primarily. Your definition of adverse impact, or how do we test for this?
Well, this is the million-dollar question in a sense, and there's so much confusion on this, and there's a whole field of industrial and organizational psychology that has trained on this and has helped to do these testings over the decades. So, the real crux of the adverse impact testing, after it came out of a Supreme Court case in the 1960s, is the Uniform Guidelines and Employment Selection Procedure, which the EEOC made in 1978. And it's also known as the 4/5 rule, and that's generally the standard that most people use when looking at adverse impact. But of course, in typical government fashion, in 1979, the EEOC came out with a statement saying, okay, although we just said this is the 1978 4/5 rule that everyone's going to know and love and use, it's just one of many methods to test. And we're not going to use it in all cases. So what happens is it becomes a battle of the experts. So, the employee will hire an expert to use one test. The employer will have an expert to use a different test. The government does the same thing. The EEOC does the same thing. And then it's just which test is more credible. So that's really where a lot of the difficulty is. There's no one method of proving adverse impact. And whether or not that should be changed is a whole different story. Nobody's come up with anything better or more innovative since 1978, and I think that's a big question mark with a lot of these laws like you're seeing in New York City and you're seeing in Europe. Everyone's saying, okay, we're going to have an auditing requirement now. Well, what does that mean? What's the new standard? How is this going to revolutionize testing now when it comes to artificial intelligence? And what you're seeing across the board is when push comes to shove, they're saying, well, look to the EEOC for testing, and like, okay, we are requiring it. So, it's falling back on us, and that's the really difficult part. But at one point I do want to mention as well, when I talk broadly more about governance related to the use of AI, so many people want to talk about the unintentional discrimination that, it's data set discrimination. You've all heard the examples about, it's a data set of men, so obviously it's not going to pick women. Easy to understand, although very complicated, easy to understand examples. But also, too, AI can be used to intentionally discriminate if people who have those existing bias suddenly get access to these systems. If people are not being trained, if vendors allow unfettered use like they do in other SaaS software programs. And if you think about that, somebody going in there and manipulating the algorithm or manipulating the data set, suddenly you can scale discrimination far and wider than we ever seen before. So although a lot of the discussion and the requirements around that disparate impact testing, it's also what are you doing internally and how are you working with the vendor to make sure that a bad actor in your organization, because we all know discrimination happens even though you have the best policies in the world. In the last 2 years, the EEOC has collected almost $1 billion of damages for victims of discrimination. How are you managing that? How are you working with the vendor to make sure the training and the proper and fair use?
So Venkat, I'm throwing it to you because how does Phenom think about adverse impact?
Yeah, great question again. So think about this from a fairness standpoint. Adverse impact, we just did an industry-wide study. It's very exhaustive in nature. It's available to talk through. But according with the study, what we realized is this exhaustive study has over 6,000 jobs. The outcome of it is our Phenom platform essentially happens to be around 97% fair, or 97.9% fair to gender and age and ableism. So we essentially have standards which we have built in from how we really put and categorize skills. It could be people profiles in different dimensions that drives fair practices in terms of just offering up suggestions. So the most important takeaway happens to be that our platform here at Phenom is essentially driven by a framework that regulates the outcome of really putting people first and driving that fairness.
So it's been mentioned already. We think about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging. These are all really important tenets of as we build this technology responsibly and test for it responsibly. So Ben, I would ask you, what is the business community, what are the questions that they're asking you in terms of adverse impact testing and serving those communities?
What I'm typically hear from employers is where in this process is it okay to use this? And again, it's what the thing I always come back to is it's really easy to get stuck in, well, is this using machine learning or is it just this advanced probabilities and whatever else? Like people want to get wrapped around the axle on those things. And what's interesting to me is when you actually look at some of the definitions of what AI is, the people that actually build the technology can't always agree on what AI actually is. The goalposts kind of move once, like, oh, it's this thing. Once they achieve that, no, it's that thing farther down the line. And because of that, I try not to get really wrapped around the axle on those things either. I don't focus on how we define AI or not. I look at the use cases, and so when I'm talking with employers, that's the most common thing. Like, can this match candidates to the right jobs? Can this help us screen these people? Can it help us identify who's likely to be a high performer based on whatever criteria we have? And those sorts of use cases are all around hiring. There are other ones throughout the entire employee lifecycle. Who's scheduled for this shift? What pay equity issues? Other things, training, all that kind of stuff. And because of that, it seems like, okay, I've got to become an expert in AI. And I hope that one of the takeaways you get from this conversation today is you do not have to be, right? That is not what any of us are advocating for you is to suddenly go out there and get your certification and become a programmer. Like, none of those things are required for you to continue doing your job well.
I think it's a really good point. Like we talk about some of the challenges that we're having, maybe, talk about some of the benefits. And Commissioner, I've heard you talk about the DEI&B space and how these technologies have the power to help those communities. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, and I'm a big fan of this. I think if it's carefully designed and properly implemented, AI can really help us meet our mission at the EEOC. And what is our mission? It's not just being a big law enforcement agency. It's not just suing you for employment discrimination. If you look at our mission statement, it's to prevent and remedy employment discrimination. That's the first part, and everyone knows this for the remedy side. But the prevent side is equally as important. It's actually before it, and it's also to promote an equal opportunity for all in the workplace. Very much the same mission and alignment of HR, very much the same mission alignment of what these softwares is trying to do. So, removing some of the very historical bias, and you all know the studies, and the reason our agency exists is that there is bias in hiring. There is bias in all aspects of employment, and as simple as a male and female applying for the same job. You all know the studies. The male's more likely to get the job. Or who's applying for the job? Males are more likely to apply to more aggressive job descriptions that they're not qualified for, and females are not. These are just very basic, long-standing issues. But AI can really remove a lot of that initial characteristics that the EEOC, race, religion, sex, national origin, whether it's directly or indirectly, have told you you're not allowed to make employment decisions on. And I think that the barrier for a lot of people with disabilities or certain protected characteristics of not getting the interview at the earliest stages because of bias, all that people can actually move forward because the computer is not going to know that if it's looking for that skills-based approach, opposed to an individual saying, oh, I don't like this name, or I don't like that they went to, they're a part of this club that may indicate their religion. So there's really a lot of that bias removing at the earliest stages that have prevented people from entering the workforce that AI can really, really benefit.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that I talk about a lot in terms of the power of these technologies to really help someone promote themselves, discovering things that they may not even realize are important in terms of negotiating for better work and better pay and all of these things. Shifting gears a little bit to generative AI, the big buzz, everyone's talking about it. We've got a lot going on in that space. One of the use cases that I've seen, and I want to get all of your opinion on this, in terms of using this new technology to kind of create some consistency in messaging. And if we think about job descriptions and using generative AI to help us write job descriptions, and I'll start with you, Ben, really your take on that. Like, what are you seeing in terms of use of this new technology and how it can help?
Yeah, there are several companies that have come out in the last month or so that have really started saying, hey, we have this built in, or it's going to help you to build better job ads, build better job descriptions, things like that. And so I know the Phenom team's working on some of those things as well. The thing that I think is helpful for employers is there's not a single one of you that got into the profession you're in saying, I cannot wait until the day I sit down and write a bunch of job descriptions, okay? As a recruiter, as an HR leader in my pre-research days, that is not something that excited me. And so having some of the tools to do that work for us, to help us create job descriptions that are more inclusive, that take out biased language, that eliminate those things that turn off certain gender or certain ethnicities that might want to apply for your jobs, I think that's a really helpful use case. And honestly, low-hanging fruit, right? It helps us to make a change instantly and doesn't require a heavy lift.
And Venkat, when we think about product, now you and I have a session tomorrow about operationalizing generative AI and new technologies. So shameless plug there, 2:15 tomorrow, come and see us. And we're going to go deep on how Phenom looks at that. But just at a 100,000-foot view, what do we think about when we think about new tech?
Yeah, so the deepfakes are going to exist, and it's going to be an interesting crisis and chaos at our hand. It's going to be like an endemic, to my earlier point. We as a society, we will see at some auto-regulatory bodies being formed, just like we had Movie Associations of America, right? I mean, it was formed. And there will be elements of watermarking, deepfakes, that are probably going to be imminent as a part of generative AI. What is more important as a society for all of us to know and understand, not just in HR, is how do we detect them, and how do we really make sure that we understand the trade-offs of those deepfakes on our lives.
So, Commissioner, when you hear, from the product side, when you hear from the business side, what's the government lens on that?
Well, when it comes to everything we're seeing with generative AI, and I read all the articles you read as well on how it can help in HR do some of these tasks, especially with job descriptions, I have serious concerns when it comes to that. I think we've made a lot of progress on job descriptions, which has really been the major barrier to entry, the major barrier to bias largely for years. How did you get a job description? You went online and Googled it, or you took your competitors, but you have no idea what you're adding in there. What historical biases from your competitor's company or just industry standard you're adding into that job that has nothing to do with the relevancy of that individual working at that location in this part of the country doing this job. So, I think HR has a real general awareness of the legal issues related to job descriptions, and now generative AI saying, oh, we'll make you the most perfect job description. It's the same problem, aside from whatever proprietary data you're putting into the internet, asking you to do this job description. But you don't know what exactly is coming out there. And although the job description may look good, if it has some requirements in there that it thinks, that ChatGPT thinks may be the best requirement or necessary requirement, and it's not, the EEOC is going to look at every single line of that job requirement, that job description, and how does it play out for those individuals applying in this role and what you're actually performing the job, or does it create bias, either directly or indirectly, of screening out people who are qualified for doing the actual job because you relied on ChatGPT to do your job description. So a lot of those historical issues that really need to be careful of using. They talk about human in the loop. Just really be careful when you're using job descriptions because they're federally protected. And in a case, we'll look at every line to see if it's necessary or if it creates bias.
Yep. So let's extend that thread a little bit to explainability, which is one of the most important tenets of some of these laws, and whether they're implemented now or whether it's making its way through the legislative process. How important is explainability to the end user?
It's a tricky dynamic in the sense where what explainability do you have to applicants now? What explainability do you have your current employees when you're making a decision? I mean, a lot of times, if somebody doesn't get the job, as we went with somebody else who is more qualified, thank you for applying. You don't know what the actual reasons behind there. So, a lot of it, are we putting new standards now on AI where we're giving additional disclosures that we didn't have to give before when a human was making a decision? Is more of a theoretic, academic, type of discussion. But, from our standpoint, like I said in the example earlier, it could really, in a sense, protect employers who don't have the well-documented of the decisions that went in there if the AI is explainable. If your data set is available and explainable. And then, what is going to be the consumer or the applicant's rights in all of this? That's a question that is really hasn't been decided yet. Like for instance, in New York, they're requiring some disclosure. In Illinois, if you're using facial recognition, there's some disclosure. But again, what are we left with under federal law is that there's not that disclosure requirements that exist now. So we can't be putting on additional requirements necessarily AI that don't exist. Now, whether or not that's best practices or not, that's a business decision to make. But there's a confusion now of, oh, we have to do these additional legal loopholes when using AI, and that's just not true. Now, you should be doing some of the same testing you can do whether you're using computers or not, and that's just long-standing law. So it goes back to that theme of, don't get confused by the proposals or regulations. Do what you know best in HR, and those practices, whether it's handbooks, policies, procedures, open doors, the things you know, it's the same when it comes to technology, because at the end of the day, again, it's the results.
So Ben, when we think about, and for our audience, one of the things I want you to take away from this session is, what questions should we be asking the creators of this technology? So asking Phenom, asking our domain, there's a lot of great competitors in our domain. What are the right questions to ask?
I think the simplest one is, what signals is this considering when it's making a decision, making a prediction, making a recommendation? What is going into that? Because as Commissioner pointed out earlier, there are things you can extrapolate. Oh, it's looking at zip code. Well, we can tell what your socioeconomic status is and possibly your race based on your zip code. Oh, it looks at your college. Well, right. And I'd say that many of the providers I've talked to have gone beyond those types of things. They realize that they can draw bias out of it. But I told people for a long time, the algorithm is no smarter than my 6-year-old. If I've told her since she was born the sky is purple, right, she's going to think the sky is purple. And the algorithm isn't smart enough to know the difference. And so you've got to be willing to ask some of those questions and really lean in on that. One thing to tack on really quickly to what you were sharing a minute ago about this is not an additional requirement or burden put on them by the government. One of the things, we just finished a study, actually asked candidates about their own consent language for using AI screening. So what are you most comfortable with? And they preferred an explanation that says we're not being judged based on all the things that are in most job descriptions already, by the way. This is, you're not being judged based on your race, your ethnicity, your age, your gender, those things. They were less preferred one that said we only look at job-related criteria and characteristics. So they preferred the one that's more protective over the one that was more explanatory.
All right, as we wrap up here, from each of you, I'll start with Venkat, a word or phrase that is a takeaway from today's session, and how can people get in touch with you?
Ethical and trusted, and at the same time, a responsible AI framework.
Cool. Ben?
I'd say human. Between the human in the loop conversation, this is a very human impact to every person you're trying to hire and support in your workforce. It's a very human impact. And other half of that was how to connect.
Yeah, how to connect.
thebeneubanks.com.
Commissioner?
I'm going to ignore your question because I can, and there's nothing you can do about it. And basically say it's a plea to all of you in the audience is like, nobody is selling me AI products. I'm not designing and developing AI products. I'm not the seller, I'm not the buyer, but yet we're responsible for giving you all the advice and guidance you need and protecting you all from that potential liability, and also enforcing these cases. So I really need to hear from you. What are the roadblocks that you have right now that's preventing the mass implementation of this technology? As I started, it's out there, it's coming, you have to use it, you're going to continue using it. How do we spur innovation here to have more of this software that can help us meet our mission and eliminate bias in the workplace? What are your concerns? And what questions, if we answered, would you feel more comfortable to be able to, whether you're VC investing in this, whether you're a vendor who wants, an entrepreneur who wants to create a product, or you're an employer who wants to buy this product or build it internally. And that's what we're lacking in this equation. I know I can keep saying a lot of it's the same, it's the employment decision making. But what can we do to help this really take off in a way that prevents discrimination?
With that, and you're going to be hanging around for a little bit?
I will be around.
So each of you will be here. Commissioner's going to has I think a 6 o'clock flight or something, but he's going to hang around. So you'll be able to see him out in the outside the venue a little bit. So definitely stop him. He really wants to know. And let's give a round of applause for our panelists today. And thank you for your time.